what if the very way your brain is wired, I mean, fundamentally, shapes how you actually experience reality? What if right now there are two completely distinct ways of seeing the world happening inside your head, offering you, well, profoundly different versions of truth? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the divided brain and reality's nature. We're drawing on some really compelling excerpts from a text that shines a light on this whole fascinating subject. Our mission really is to unpack how our brain's two hemispheres give us these dramatically different perspectives. And crucially, what happens when that balance shifts, how it impacts, well, everything from simple perception right up to mental health. Prepare to have your understanding of reality, maybe even yourself, expanded a bit. Okay, let's unpack this a bit. The core idea from the text is this concept of two kinds of attention, two worlds. It's suggesting our brain hemispheres don't just process things differently, but they actually have distinct ways of focusing attention. And this leads to, well, fundamentally different perceptions of reality. It's not just a slight difference, apparently. It's like living in two separate conceptual universes at the same time.
Precisely. Yeah, let's start with the left hemisphere, as the text lays it out. Its approach is really all about deconstruction, breaking the world down into manageable bits and pieces, categorizing, abstracting, manipulating information, mainly for practical use, for utility. So its version of reality is described as being very much like a map. Simplified, it's functional, absolutely.
Right.
But, and this is key, it's stripped of that vibrant, living context. It's really about what can be used, what can be measured, controlled.
That map world idea, it sounds incredibly efficient, obviously, which we need for daily life, right?
Mhm.
But if we lean too heavily on just that map, what's the biggest blind spot? Or maybe how does it subtly diminish our experience without us even noticing? Where does that mechanical feeling really show up?
That's a really good question. Because the map is useful, like you said, getting from A to B, but it doesn't capture the smell of the forest or the feeling of the wind, right? So relying only on that can lead to this sense of disconnect, where life feels sort of flattened out, or like you're just going through the motions. You might achieve your goals, sure, but the richness, the implicit meaning, that deep connection to what you're actually doing, that can get lost. It kind of reduces the experience down to data points rather than, lived moments. And then, in stark contrast, you have the right hemisphere. It offers this profoundly different way of seeing. It perceives the world as alive, as interconnected, constantly changing. It values context above everything else. It recognizes uniqueness. It grasps that implicit meaning. So this hemisphere provides a much more holistic, you could say more embodied experience of reality. It embraces all the complexity and richness that the left hemisphere might, for its own useful purposes, strip away. It's the difference between experiencing the forest itself versus just seeing its outline on a map.
Right. And this leads directly into what the text calls the different intentions of each hemisphere. This is where, for me, it really starts to click. The left hemisphere's intention is described as being fundamentally instrumental. It's driven by this desire to control, to use, to acquire things. It wants to get stuff done, basically, to master its environment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that drive is, of course, essential. For survival, for navigating the world efficiently, we need that. But then you have the right hemisphere's intention, which is described as more existential. Its aim is to understand, to connect, to perceive wholes, not just the parts. It's about meaning, it's about relationship, not just pure utility. And the point is, both are profoundly necessary. Our well-being really seems to hinge on them being in balance. The text makes this powerful case that an imbalance can really distort how we experience reality, making life feel, and this is their phrase, skeletal and mechanical, if that right hemisphere's capacity for complexity and richness isn't, well, fully engaged.
That idea of distortion due to imbalance is really powerful. Does the text offer any clues about why one hemisphere might become dominant? Maybe in certain societies, or even just through our own individual habits?
Well, it doesn't spell out one single cause for every case, but it definitely implies that things like our cultural values, maybe our education systems, even our daily routines, they can inadvertently end up favoring one mode of processing over the other. I mean, if we're constantly breaking things down, analyzing, optimizing everything, well, we're naturally exercising that left hemisphere much more, and that could potentially be to the detriment of the right hemisphere's way of seeing things.
Okay, so moving to the more practical side. Let's explore the mental health implications that the source material gets into. This is where these kind of abstract ideas really hit home.
Oh, they absolutely do. The text points out how conditions like schizophrenia, for example, often seem to reflect a significant left hemisphere dominance, but crucially, without that balancing influence from the right hemisphere. And this can lead to things like patients interpreting metaphors completely literally, losing all sense of context, and constructing these beliefs that are rigid but actually deeply irrational. Though within their own fragmented reality, they might seem perfectly logical step by step.
Yeah, the text gives that really stark example, doesn't it? A patient hearing voices and then meticulously deducing that it must be the neighbors hacking their electronics. I mean, from a purely linear, step-by-step deduction view, maybe it seems rational to them, but it just completely lacks that broader sense of reasonableness, of context,
Yeah.
which is exactly what the right hemisphere usually provides, that sense of what's plausible overall.
Right. And what's truly insightful here, something highlighted from research in the text, is this distinction. Depressed patients often say something like, something is wrong with my mind. Okay. Whereas schizophrenic patients are more likely to say something is wrong with my brain. Okay. Now that subtle difference in language, it reveals these incredibly different ways of perceiving oneself, which seem tied to their hemispheric function. And it also connects to another really compelling research finding mentioned, that schizophrenic patients were found disproportionately studying things like engineering or analytical philosophy fields that heavily rely on left hemisphere functions, analysis, logic. Conversely, those with bipolar disorders tend to gravitate towards literature, music, history fields that are generally seen as more right hemisphere heavy.
That link to specific career paths or fields of study is incredibly concrete. Does the text explore why that might be? Like, do people gravitate to fields that match their dominant hemisphere? Or maybe it's societal structures that unconsciously push us towards certain ways of thinking, potentially making these imbalances worse?
The author suggests it could very well be a kind of self-reinforcing loop. People naturally gravitate towards activities or subjects that feel comfortable or where they excel. So if your left hemisphere is already sort of dominant, feels rewarding that analytical, decontextualized thinking are naturally going to appeal more. And then, of course, immersing yourself in those fields further strengthens those particular neural pathways. So it's this fascinating interplay between maybe an inherent inclination and the environmental shaping.
Hmm. This actually brings us to a really personal story that's shared by the speaker in the text. It helps humanize these abstract concepts.
Indeed, yeah. The speaker talks about their own journey. They initially studied literature, but then made this really pivotal shift into psychiatry. And this change apparently came after this profound realization they had that reducing art, like a poem or a novel, to just paraphrase or analytical dissection, it just stripped it of all its meaning, its essence. They felt something absolutely vital was being lost in that very left hemisphere dominant approach to it.
Right. And that moment reading Oliver Sacks, it sounds like that was a powerful catalyst. It inspired them to really dig into how these brain differences fundamentally shape our experience. And that ultimately guided their medical career path, not just to understand the brain mechanically, but how it influences our entire way of being, our perception. So ultimately, what this seems to reveal is that how we choose to know something, whether we dissect it or embrace it whole, isn't just academic. It's core to our life's path, isn't it? For you, what's maybe the single most critical takeaway from all this about how our brain's wiring might be influencing our search for knowledge, or even just our day-to-day decisions?
That's a big question. For me, I think the most critical takeaway is the sort of implicit warning against reductionism in all its forms. The left hemisphere is brilliant, absolutely brilliant at breaking things down, analyzing, but true understanding, whether you're talking about a poem or another person or a really complex world problem, it seems to require the right hemisphere's capacity for context, for seeing connections, for grasping the whole. Without that balance, we risk living in a world that's highly functional, yes, but ultimately kind of impoverished, lacking that richness. It really highlights the constant need to seek that broader perspective, I think.
So, we've really covered a lot of ground today, diving into this profound idea that our brain hemispheres fundamentally shape our reality, from the basics of how we pay attention right through to our deepest intentions, and even touching on our mental well being. It's just a powerful reminder, isn't it, that there isn't just one single way to experience or understand the world we live in.
Yeah, exactly. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, just having an awareness of these two distinct modes of perception, it can potentially really enrich your understanding,
Yeah.
both of the world around you and maybe just as importantly, of yourself. It kind of invites you to consider the inherent biases in how you personally process information and maybe think about the perspectives you might be unconsciously missing out on.
Right. So, here's maybe a provocative thought for you, the listener, to consider as we wrap up. How might you consciously try to invite more of that right hemisphere's way of seeing, the holistic, the contextual, the interconnected view into your daily life? or maybe into your problem solving, especially given its incredible capacity for understanding and perceiving wholes. Perhaps it's about consciously stepping back from just the details sometimes, trying to see the bigger picture, or seeking out that implicit meaning that lies beyond just the explicit words. Something to think about until next time.